And this interconnectedness of salvation is a theme that crops up several times in Jesus' teachings. We see it most clearly in another passage from Matthew, the so-called judgment of the nations, or the parable of the sheep and the goats, in Matthew 25. And here, in that parable, Jesus directly connects salvation with service to the poor, the stranger, the prisoner. And that's consistent also with Jesus' close linking of love of God with love of neighbor, the two great commandments in Matthew 22. All of this adds up to a picture of the self, radically different from that sense of individuals as billiard balls, occasionally bumping into one another. Okay? And I want to suggest that when Jesus tells his followers, I am the vine, you are the branches, that he's pointing, among other things, to a deeper interconnection between individuals, between us. What happens to one of the branches can affect not only other branches, but also the vine itself. Fungus and rot, for example, can spread from one part of the vine to other parts. And just as the branches connect to one another through the vine, and indeed cannot live apart from it, so we are connected one with another in the divine reality, in God. And I wonder if St. Paul might have had something similar in mind when he teaches in Athens that it is in God that we live and move and have our being. I would argue that it is that way with us, that we're not separate individuals, each free to pursue his or her own self-interest unhindered. We're deeply connected in one interwoven network. What affects one affects us all. And that's the reason, to use the technical term, the ontological basis for the radical connection that Jesus draws both between the rich young man's salvation and the fate of the poor, on the one hand, and between loving God and loving one's neighbor, on the other. If we really are deeply interconnected one to another in and through the divine, then we cannot love God without loving the neighbor as one loves himself. And also, salvation and love of God cannot be purely a matter of me and Jesus, okay, which we often see in some evangelical and fundamentalist contexts. Salvation has to include our relations with our neighbors. In a profound sense, the other is the self. We have wider self-interests precisely because we have a wider self. What one person does ripples out along the fabric of being and then ripples back onto us. Okay? We're never all in this alone. So the libertarian economic thinkers are not wrong in stressing self-interest as the motive factor in producing social goods. Where they go astray is in focusing on the immediate self-interest of disconnected individuals in essentially adversarial relations. Remember Adam Smith's butcher and baker we talked about before. In framing market relations as either benevolence or self-love, Smith gives us a false dichotomy. He overlooks the fact that the butcher and the baker also live in a wider community with their neighbors, with their customers, with whom they share wider interests. And indeed, in hard times, the butcher might give away a few cuts of meat to customers who can't pay. That would violate the butcher's immediate self-interest in making a profit, but it would contribute to the wider self-interest of looking after his or her neighbors. So, Perhaps the individual pursuit of immediate self-interest can occasionally produce social goods as an unintended consequence. The present crisis, however, drives home the fact that unintended consequences can also be negative, even disastrous, to the wider self-interest. Now, if we are indeed deeply interconnected, as Christian teaching suggests, then the economic welfare of every person, from the undocumented worker all the way to the Fortune 500 CEO, is intrinsically bound up with the welfare of the whole. And accordingly, Christians should promote a fundamental shift of U.S. economic policy away from the immediate self-interest of businesses and investors and toward the wider self-interest of society. Economic policy must work to prevent any person's or corporate entities' pursuit of immediate self-interest from damaging the wider self-interest. How do we do that? Well, it's not easy, obviously. And as the example of the rich young man shows, it's always been difficult for any one person to see beyond his or her own immediate self-interest. It's even more difficult to grasp that wider perspective in the complex society in which we live today, where the butcher and the baker and the brewer may not know their customers personally. And in this situation, we cannot trust the welfare of the social whole to the voluntary benevolence of persons. It requires a wider perspective, a communal perspective. Can we look to corporations for that wider perspective? No. They are constitutionally unable to look to the wider perspective because they are constitutionally set up to look after the interests of their shareholders. It makes no sense to leave the wider self-interest to those who are neither set up nor motivated to protect it. I would argue that only the federal government is set up to take on that wider perspective. A democratic government is responsible to all of us, to the wider society, the wider self-interest. And indeed, the federal government is constitutionally chartered to promote the general welfare, as it says in the preamble to the U.S. Constitution. Our deregulatory bench, the ideology of immediate self-interest, prevented the government from following through on its mission of promoting the general welfare. Now, while tighter government regulation of the financial system may not have been in the immediate self-interest of predatory lenders or those who developed and traded in the risky derivatives backed by toxic assets, it clearly would have been in the wider self-interest of all Americans. Now, certainly government, including a democratic one, as we've seen over and over again, can abuse its power. Nonetheless, economists like Williams are wrong to regard the relations between the government and the person as essentially adversarial. This is another false dichotomy, like Adam Smith's benevolence versus self-love. A democratic government is not some adversary separate from you or me. In the final analysis, a democratic government is us. Government is as much a part of the wider self as other individuals. Now, government can also contribute to the problem. We can have regulators who will be tempted to defend the immediate self-interests of those they regulate.